Good evening. My name is Jared Ortiz. I am the chair of the Religion Department and the director of the Saint Benedict Institute. And thank you for coming out tonight for our civil dialogue on sex and gender. We'd particularly like to thank our co-sponsors, the Provost's Office, the Dean for Arts and Humanities, the Pre-Law Society, and the Department of Philosophy. So thank you. The questions around sex and gender are some of the most contentious ones in our society today. These are questions that divide friends and families and churches. At root, these are questions about what it means to be human, about identity and purpose, and how to be happy. These questions also touch on questions of who God is, the meaning of creation, how God made us, and how to read the Bible. Because sex and gender touch on such fundamental questions, we must talk about them. Thankfully, we are at a college that takes dialogue seriously. We have the virtues of public discourse, and a new freedom of expression policy, which ensure that we do not become enclosed in our ideological silos, but learn to seek the truth together. So we need to dialogue about these deep questions, even if it makes us uncomfortable sometimes, because only in this way will we make progress in understanding what it means to be human. Tonight, we have two distinguished guests who will help us to think about sex and gender. Both our speakers are faithful, committed Christians who have thought deeply and written books about sex and gender. They are also both committed to civil dialogue and helping people come to the truth. John Bursch is the senior counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom. He has argued 12 U.S. Supreme Court cases, including cases defending the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage and sexuality. His most recent book, Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, was published in 2023. Dr. Megan DeFranza is a counselor, author, speaker, theologian, and, recently, filmmaker. She holds a PhD in religious studies with a concentration in sex and gender and sexuality. PhD is from Marquette. Very ecumenical of you. Her books include Sex Difference in Christian Theology, Male, Female, and Intersex in the Image of God. Additionally, she directed the documentary Stories of Intersex and Faith, which we screened recently. Now, a number of those books are on sale in the back, but this is also Dr. DeFranza's monograph that she wrote, which is accessible to read and very good. And then Mr. Bursch's looks like that. So let me just say briefly how tonight is going to go. I will moderate a dialogue with our guests for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes of questions from the audience. So please stay the whole time, students. We have two students on either side who are going around with note cards. So if you know you're the kind of person who likes to ask a question, just wave at those people, they'll give you a note card. And when you have your question, write it down, and they will collect it. So they'll just be walking up and down the whole time. So when you hear something you don't like, wave to those people, get your note card, write down your question, and then give it back to them. And so we will they will continually collect those questions, and we'll ask as many as we can. Now, if you're a student, please write student at the top, and we will privilege your questions. Okay? All right, so let's get started. So the first question I want to ask both our speakers is, how do you understand God's vision for sex and gender? Megan, please go first.
That's an easy one. So John and I were talking at dinner about how when we usually speak, we get about 45 to 60 minutes, sometimes longer. But our lovely friends here at the Benedict Institute said you get 5 minutes. So you'll forgive me for reading my notes so that I can stay within those 5 minutes. We'll go back.
You already used 1 minute.
5 minutes, I know. That was more like 20 seconds. I did check this. Thank you for having us here. Really, thank you for coming, all of that. I think we can all agree that, certainly up here, that the place we begin to understand sex and gender, we have to look first to the book of Genesis, right? God's creation of humankind in God's image, male and female, God created them, blessed them, and said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Now, some theologians look at the phrase "be fruitful and multiply" as a command, and others as a blessing. Either way, at this point in the story, at the beginning, it makes sense to see the words literally as filling the earth with descendants, which is why we get those long list of begats later in Genesis. St. Augustine, in his teachings on marriage and virginity, said that before the birth of Christ, be fruitful and multiply was a command. But after Jesus was born, it's no longer necessary. He believed that the church could grow by conversion rather than procreation. He believed that celibacy is what God wanted for humans. It was God's best. But God permitted marriage and procreation, which, while it wasn't God's best, was still good, because there were a lot of people in the ancient world who were saying it wasn't good at all. He believed that sexual desire, sinful in itself, could be forgiven if it was undertaken in the service of procreation. In another of his writings, he speaks about those who are not male and female. In his work, The City of God, he talks about other kinds of humans, which he's using ancient words that we don't really use anymore because they're not PC. But he says, although androgynes, whom we also call hermaphrodites, are very rare, it's difficult to find periods where they do not occur. In them, the marks of both sexes appear together in such a way that it is uncertain from which they should properly receive their name. He goes on to say that we've given hermaphrodites the name from the better sex, the masculine. You can love him and hate him in the same passage. Maybe Augustine felt no qualms talking about those whose bodies are not clearly male and female, because Jesus does this in the book, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19. Jesus talks about Genesis 1 and 2 earlier in the chapter, and then in verse 12, he mentions those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs by others, and those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The first type of eunuch Jesus names is the eunuch from birth, and here he's using one of 6 additional categories that ancient rabbis created to identify babies who were born not clearly male or female. Now, it makes sense. If you need to know who to circumcise, and you have a child who's born and you're not sure of their sex, the rabbi is going to get called in and going to see a lot more diversity than the rest of us see. And so they came up with extra language to name all of the people in the community. Jesus uses one of those. In Hebrew, it's the saris chama, eunuch of the sun. Then there, who's masculine of center. Ailonit would be feminine of center, androgynos in the middle, and tumtum, which means we're not sure now, but we're pretty sure that in time we'll figure out how to categorize this human. So the rabbis searched the Hebrew scriptures for wisdom on how to apply the rules of Torah to those bodies whose blended the categories of male and female. Where should they sit? Whom can they marry? In our documentary, Stories of Intersex and Faith, there's a Jewish scholar who says that androgynos and tumtum are mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, an ancient commentary on Torah, over 300 times. So while rare, they were not swept under the theological rug. And these are the only kinds of intersex traits that were visible in the ancient world externally. They didn't have the technology to look at chromosomes, which we know are not just XX and XY, but XO, XXY, XXYY, some cells with one pattern, some cells with another, or genetic variations on those chromosomes, like how the SRY gene can move off of the Y chromosome and onto an X, or hormone levels, or hormone receptors, which are in cells throughout the body and the brain. Today, we know there are many more variations in sex characteristics than those mentioned by Jesus, Augustine, and the rabbis. And the work that I've done, particularly in the Sex Difference in Christian Theology book, is to try to follow the rabbi's example, to think theologically, searching the scriptures, searching Christian history, to think about how the reality of the diverse groups of people that God has made, how do we reconcile this with what we read in Genesis, which is what I'll use my next 5 minutes to talk about.
Okay. Well, I'll do something similar. I'm going to take the intersex issue and kind of put a pin in that for a minute, and just use my opening 5 minutes to dive a little bit deeper into Genesis 1 and 2. And we're all familiar with Genesis 1. God is creating night and day and the land and the sea and the birds and everything else. And after everything that he creates, he looks at it and he sees that it is good. And when he creates man, he sees that it is very good. So all's going well. Well, then we have a second version of the creation story in Genesis 2. And this is where we kind of zoom in on the creation of man specifically. And God creates man, and he sees something that is not good for the very first time. What's that? Well, it's that man is alone. And kind of as a standalone observation, that doesn't make a lot of sense because he's got birds and animals of all kinds surrounding him. So he's not alone. But he is alone in that there's no one else like him. And God sees that he needs an ezer. And that Hebrew word, E-Z-E-R, is a special word. Sometimes we think of it as a helpmate, like a gopher or a secretary, but that's not at all what the Bible means. An ezer is someone who is indispensable to the fulfillment and success of somebody. God himself is referenced as an ezer 16 times in the Old Testament. So that gives you an idea about how important and crucial this helpmate is. And so we know what happens next. God puts Adam to sleep, and he creates Eve. And then Adam comes out of his sleep, and he sees her. And they're both standing there, and they're naked. So they can see all of their similarities and all of their differences. And he says, "At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And so he realizes that all at once, that she is different than all the animals and birds because she was made like him. She was made to be with him. But he can also see that they're different, that they're complementary. Every one of us in this room has our own circulatory system and a respiratory system, but we only have half a reproductive system. That system only functions when it's with someone else. And so then when God gives that first cultural mandate, be fruitful and multiply, that's exactly what he's referring to, that man and woman will leave their mother and father and become one flesh to have a conjugal relationship. And through that relationship, they can actually create a third person. And what's beautiful about all of this is that it's an icon for God that helps us understand a little bit more about God's nature. Because if you go back to that Genesis passage, God says we'll make man in our image, in our likeness. And that must have sounded strange to anybody who was reading the Bible for the very first time. What's this plurality of persons? Well, we know through the rest of the Bible that there's a Trinity, that there's a God the Father and a God the Son, and their eternal love for each other precedes God the Holy Spirit. And in the same way, the love between a man and a woman in marriage through that conjugal relationship proceeds from them, a third person that needs its own name, a son or a daughter. And so that relationship is an image or an icon of the Trinity. It's the beautiful way that God created us. And the fundamental piece of all of this is that body is not just a construct, that it actually means something, that we are not inanimate souls who are trapped in a shell that we call our bodies. And we all know this intuitively, because if I walked across the room and I slapped someone, you wouldn't say, "You slapped my body," you would say, "You slapped me." Our bodies and our souls are inextricably linked. And so the way our body is made says something about who we are, and that's not something that we can walk away from. And science shows us that, although you have an intersex condition, which we can discuss, that for the vast majority of people, they develop to become men or women. 1 in 10,000 will be born with an intersex condition where they really can't be classified as male or female at birth. And so from this relationship, from this body, we then understand that the body has great meaning. And I'm sure we're going to get into this with more of the dialogue. But in today's modern society, where we're pushing on kids as young as kindergarten, sometimes even younger, that they can pick what their sex or gender is, by divorcing their gender from their sex, which cannot be changed, that it does great harm to them. And there's lots of scientific evidence to support that. But we have a long road to travel, I think, before we get to there.
Good. So let me follow up with each of you individually. So Megan, you focus most of your first 6 minutes on highlighting sexual minorities. Would that be all right to say?
Sex, not sexual.
Sex minorities. Good. Thank you.
Biological sex.
But then at the end, you said you wanted to come back to Genesis and the sort of strong emphasis on male and female. And so maybe you could just elaborate on that approach and how you see sex minorities fitting into this original paradigm.
Thanks. Yeah. So John, in his book, uses some numbers on the frequency of intersex that are lower than some of the numbers that I've seen elsewhere. He uses an article from 22 years ago by a guy who thinks that girls and boys are so different they shouldn't even be educated together in schools. So I don't think those numbers are as current as the stats that we have today. And that's an important thing to talk about. I go to intersex because we all know about male and female and procreation, and maybe we should have just asked John to speak first. But a lot of people say, how do we reconcile bodies that don't fit male and female with what we find in Genesis? And so when we look more carefully, we see in Genesis, God creates day and night, but no dawn and dusk. Land and sea, but no rivers, or estuaries where fresh water and salt water mix. There are animals that walk on land, and birds that fly, and fish that swim in the sea, but no penguins, or ostriches, or lobsters, or whales, or insects, or amphibians. Now, have you ever heard a preacher say that those creatures, lobsters and insects, are signs of the fall because they aren't mentioned in Genesis 1 and blur the categories of creation, that they're not good somehow? Anybody heard that sermon? Me neither. But that's the first thing I hear when I help people understand the diversity of sex traits that some people have in their bodies. Genesis is meant to teach us about the relationship between God and creation. It is not an inventory of the only good creatures that God has made. Now, Mr. Bursch writes in his book that really it's not just that male and female are majorities. He said this is what God made. And he writes, just because a rare person's physical sex characteristics at the macro level, as opposed to the cellular, might be ambiguous, does not mean that sex for the human population as a whole is not binary. And I mentioned kind of the pushing back against the statistics. And in my book, I write several pages addressing this individual's article and why, several pages to explain why it's so hard to get good numbers on the number of people who have intersex variations. We're not present for birth in many countries. And in many places, a kid with sex variations is considered a curse or unsafe, and parents are like, don't count my child, like I don't want anybody to know what's happening here, because they don't want the stigma. Now, we all saw this summer the kind of hatred that humans are capable of hurling at someone whose body didn't look feminine enough to compete as a female boxer in the Olympics, despite medical assurance that she has no identifiable variations in sex traits. People didn't care about the truth. They wanted to fight about binary gender, and her personhood was collateral damage. The church has a very long history, a very bad track record of treatment and theological reflection on bodies that differ from the majority. A dear man I know, educated in Catholic elementary school, was hit with a ruler every time he picked up his pencil with his left hand. Left in Latin is sinistra, from which we get sinister. Left-handed people were considered bad omens. Interestingly enough, 100 years ago, the number of people who identified as left-handed was much smaller than the number of people who identify as left-handed today. John writes in his book that the theory of sex as a spectrum is the exact opposite of truth that helps humans grow into who God designed them to be. Now, I think we both agree that Christians must be people of the truth, but what I'm trying to communicate is that the truth is more complicated. Yes, the majority of humans fit into the categories of male and female, but there is a minority of people who don't. And how do we think Christianly about these folks? The Bible starts with Adam and Eve, but goes on to tell a story of God folding in more and more people, different kinds of people, into God's family. It starts with Adam and Eve, but it doesn't end there. We are not trying to get back to the Garden of Eden. We look forward to a future where people from every tribe and tongue and people and nation will gather around a throne. We didn't have different languages in the garden. We didn't have different people groups. There is so much more diversity at the end of our story than there is at the beginning. Genesis is the place we start, but it's not the end of the conversation. So what is God's vision for sex and gender? My bigger question for many of us is, what is God's vision for humans? Which is for all of us to be conformed to the image of Christ, to grow in holiness, to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit. Jesus says the scriptures hang on two commands: love God and love our neighbors, and illustrates what this looks like in his parable of the Good Shepherd, who is not content to minister and care for the 99 sheep who are safe in the pen. He leaves the 99 and goes after the one because all of his sheep matter. And he models that for us. History shows that the fruit of the Spirit, holiness, virtues, go against gender ideals in the ancient world and today. But Christians are never called to put conformity to cultural gender roles ahead of conformity to Christ. Marriage is optional. It's a wonderful thing. Conformity to the character of Jesus is not optional. Thank you.
Thank you. John, to follow up on something you said, and then you could fold in some of your, so you were taking notes on what Megan was saying. So you really focused on conjugal relations between male and female in the garden, and you really focused on iconography, the body as an icon, and that it has meaning. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what an icon is and how that's helpful, and then maybe speak a little more to the meaning of the body.
Yeah, so an icon is just something that we look at that allows us to understand something else. It's an image of something else. And in fact, much of what we see here on earth is really an icon of what we'll see someday in heaven. Much of what we read about in the Old Testament is an icon of what we're going to see coming to pass in the New Testament. And so when you think about the nature of the sexed human body, about a husband and a wife coming together and being able to create a third person as being an icon of the Trinity, it's teaching us something about God. That's what makes it theology of the body, in the way that Pope John Paul II talks about it in his great discourse on that subject. And I want to pause here because I've got several points of agreement with things that Megan said. First, there's nobody who should be shunned or treated poorly because of how their body developed or who they are. I don't think anybody thinks that. I think hopefully everybody in this room agrees, number one, that Scripture should guide our life, and number two, that God loves everybody and we're called to do the same thing. And in the same way, I think all of us would agree, I certainly do, that we should conform ourselves to Jesus Christ, not to any societal standard of what male or female is. After all, back in the 1920s, people don't remember this, but pink was the preferred color for boys because it was the strong color. And so baby boys in the hospital were given pink garments. That's not true today. It's because that's a cultural norm. It doesn't have anything to do with God's eternal truths. But when we're talking about the importance of truth in the body, we might be talking past each other a little bit. What my book is focused primarily on are those individuals who there's no dispute that they're male or they're female, but they identify as a different gender, whether that be the opposite gender or multiple genders or no gender at all, genderqueer, two-spirit. I mean, you can go on and on. There's more than 80 different types of gender categories today. And there's, as we're going to talk, that the science shows that there's something dangerous to the person when they deny who they are by denying what their body is. And I'm still kind of now setting intersex in this separate category. So now to sweep that in, let's talk a little bit about the passage that she points to in Matthew 19 about the eunuch. So first, this is a conversation about marriage, where Jesus reaffirms that statement from Genesis that a man and a woman will leave their parents and that they will come together in a one flesh relationship. So he's talking about the very essence of what it means to be male or female. That word eunuch, if you look at all the standard classical, New Testament, and patristic Greek lexicographers, they almost unanimously define that as one of two things, a eunuch. It's either a male person lacking the ability to beget children, either because of castration, accident, or congenital defect, or it's a male palace official, a servant in a royal household, whether they're castrated or not. And that's consistent with another passage that she relies on in her book, Isaiah 56, 3-7, which uses the word eunuch in the context of a dry tree, that is, someone who is infertile, someone who's unable to have children. And so there are some sources a couple hundred years after Jesus that use eunuch in the different ways that she was talking about, but it's difficult to find them at the time that the New Testament was written. And in fact, some of those other sources, like the Mishnah, distinguish eunuchs from persons whose gender was confused due to intersex conditions or other physical reasons. But even if you accepted the premise that a eunuch might have meant something else at the time Jesus used that word in Matthew 19, it doesn't mean that he used it that way. So for example, in the United States, there was a psychologist, John Money, in the 1950s, and he's the one who explained to people that gender is different than sex. And we could go into the methods that he used and how discredited those are, and that the results that he reached because of that aren't credible either. But the fact is, when he started using gender to mean something different than sex, no one else was doing that. So if you look back and imputed his understanding of gender to other people who use that word, you'd be getting it wrong. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court, she used sex and gender interchangeably through all of her legal briefs and arguments in the 1970s and 80s. And so if you attributed to her what John Money meant by gender, you would be doing her a tremendous disservice. And it would be the same thing by taking an obscure source and then imputing that to Jesus, who's speaking in the context of a passage that's all about the binary, male and female. And then the last thing is that even if Jesus was referring to intersex people with eunuch, and I don't think that the scholarship would support that, that doesn't mean that God created more than one sex or that he created a sex spectrum. The phrase that Megan uses in her book to describe people with an intersex condition is disorder of sexual development, DSD, and that's a pretty common way to define it. And what that means is that someone developed and their body didn't develop the way that it was supposed to, the way that science would have expected it to. In some ways, the various ways that things can go wrong in our development, it's almost amazing that the intersex numbers are so low. And the reason why my percentage is lower than maybe other sources that she's looked at is you can define intersex in different ways, based on the chromosomes, based on the physical characteristics. I'm going to limit it to the gametes that you produce. If you produce eggs, you're female. If you produce sperm, you're a male. And with that as the definition, the number of people who are intersex at birth is about 1 in 10,000. But that's not the only type of where the trajectory gets off on development. You can imagine someone who has a deformed hand as a result of a congenital birth defect. That population is actually 2 out of 1,000. So you're 10 times more likely to have a baby with a deformed hand than you are to have someone who's born intersex the way that I've just described it. Now, we all know, beginning at least in kindergarten, and your poor friend who had that teacher who was so cruel with the ruler, that we have 2 types of hands. There are right hands and there are left hands. And if one of these people is born with a congenital defect in their hand, say they have 3.5 fingers, we don't say that they have a third kind of hand or that God created hands on a spectrum. What we say is that it didn't develop in the way that it was supposed to. Now, does that mean that there's something wrong with that person? Of course not. Does that mean that they're outside God's kingdom? Of course not. Does that mean that we should treat them any differently than we would anybody else? Of course not. And the same is true for our intersex members of our family. We are all ultimately children of Christ and should be treated that way. But that doesn't change the fact that biologically as well as theologically, sex is a binary.
Megan, I saw you writing many things down, and I want you to get to them. But maybe you could help us here, because we're using a lot of terms, intersex, and which has been the focus of a lot of your studies and your most recent documentary. John seems more concerned with gender things and transgender and things like that. So maybe you could just, Megan, you could just give us a brief primer on intersex and transgender, if there's any relation or conceptually, and then feel free to develop from there.
Yes, thank you. No, connecting these dots is important. With someone who has an intersex trait, and John said that I use the word disorder of sex development. I don't. I say that is one of the ways that physicians have referred to people with differences of sex development. People in the community see DSD as difference in sex development, or they talk about having variations in sex traits. So that's a very pathologizing language that I list as a way that people are referred to, but it's not how I refer to people of this community. So the difference between an intersex person and a transgender, most intersex folks identify with their gender majority in a binary manner, even if their body might not be binary, oftentimes their gender is. But for some people with intersex variations, and it's interesting that certain kinds do and certain don't, they have a sense that their gender doesn't match the body that they look like on the outside. And so for them, they have a transgender experience, and they may not know that they have these differences in their body. If doctors find differences to verify that they are intersex, then we put them on the intersex side. If doctors look at the body of a trans person and say, well, we can't find any markers of intersex here, then we put them on the trans side of things. The challenge is getting genetic testing done is very difficult and very expensive. A lot of these tests are difficult. I have a friend who taught theology at a Christian college in California. He was the chair of the Bible and Theology department, beloved professor for 15 years. Came out as trans, lost his job, found out several years later that he has intersex traits. Nobody offered him his job back. He still can't get hired. His family suffered incredibly. So often Christians will distinguish, well, if they're born that way, if they're intersex, then they're okay. Jesus talks about them, that's fine. But the trans people, they're lying about their body. Well, maybe we don't know all of those things. Some intersex traits, like complete androgen insensitivity, you will have a baby with XY chromosomes, which is your typical male pattern, which then leads to testes, which produce typical amounts of male hormones, but the cell receptors throughout the body can't process testosterone. So the body develops and looks feminine. The genitals are feminine at birth. The child is identified as a female. Puberty comes, no menstruation. That's usually when things are discovered. Oh, so you have testes but no uterus, a short vagina. But if you leave those testes in at puberty, when they, ramp up to do what puberty does, the body converts that testosterone into estrogen, and their bodies are feminized. They grow breasts. So their insides look masculine, their outsides look feminine, and most of them almost always identify as having a female gender identity. There's another kind of intersex called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where you have an XX baby, typical female pattern, ovaries, but in every, body, every non-intersex, we call it endosex. It's another term to say. So I'm an endosex female, means I don't have intersex traits in my body that I know of. Testosterone is something that female bodies make too. But in these bodies, they make higher levels of testosterone than what would be typical for a female. And if it's very high, it can masculinize the genitals so that you can have XX chromosomes and ovaries, but genitals that can be all the way over to looking masculine or feminine or something in between, depending on how high that testosterone is. Now, for that intersex trait, you have many more people dissatisfied with their sex assignment as female. It has something to do with the processing of hormones. You can't process any hormones in the complete androgen insensitivity. Female gender identity, despite XY chromosomes and testes. Lots of testosterone or somewhere in between, much more dissatisfaction with sex assignment at birth. So I am not one of those gender ideologists who believe that sex and gender are completely unrelated. I believe that gender identity is rooted in our bodies, and our bodies are more complex than what we learned in 8th grade biology class. And so we're still at the beginning of learning about the neuroscience and the impact of hormones on the brain. There's still so much more we need to learn, but I think just those two examples of some of the most frequent kinds of intersex show that there is a relationship between hormone levels and gender identity. Does that answer
Yeah,
your
and
question?
just to follow up on that, I know probably the studies and statistics on this are probably just at the very beginning, but we have a growing number of people identifying as trans now. Would you surmise, I don't know if that's fair to say, but anyway, would you surmise that if we actually were able to do some studies, we would find that there was, intersex at the bottom of most of these transgender?
I think for many trans experiences, we may find that. I don't think we're there yet, and we can't know. And we need a lot of caution. I think this is where John and I actually agree quite a bit on the caution needed, particularly around children and teens whose bodies are in a long season of transition, where we're just saying, oh yeah, you're trans, great, let's go, let's block your hormones, let's do the cross-sex hormones, we need to slow that way, way, way down, and I think we are on the same page
100%.
with that.
Did you want to do more? You took a lot of notes. I gave you an assignment, but now it's your turn.
So yes, you talked about the family being an icon of the Trinity, and I talk about this in my Sex Difference in Christian Theology book, and I think Adam and Eve are the first image, and we see marriage as an important theological metaphor for God's relationship with humans. But marriage, in John Paul II's Theology of the Body, which you're following, I know you're not a theologian, you're following the Pope, good Catholic boy. I fight with the Pope in my book, just so you know. He says it's the icon of the Trinity, that marital love is the exemplar par excellence of Trinitarian love. And I think that love is what's in the Trinity. Sexual love in marriage is an icon. Friendship is an icon. Parental love of children is an icon. And I think, again, looking at the trajectory, Adam and Eve are the beginning of the story, but the end of the story is Christ, the bridegroom, and the church as the bride. So we have two, but the ultimate icon of Trinitarian love is the church. It's this eschatological community that's much more than three and way beyond biological connection. And that is how we bring God's presence and visibility into the world. That's what it means to be an icon, to be a visible representation of an invisible reality.
Thank you. Now, you all should be writing down questions right now, because we're coming to that part in a few minutes. So if you have questions, hand them. Our people are walking back and forth with their cards. If you need one, write it down. If you think you have one, get a card and then hand them back. John, maybe you could follow up just a little bit on some of the things Megan said, but maybe you could take on the pushback that you're getting from Megan, and that's been really coming on for decades against the binary system of thinking about sex and gender. And just to make this a little personal here, so one student of mine who identified as a woman when she was my student and has graduated, and now she identifies as trans, and she and uses the pronouns they them. Shared that by embracing this trans identity, they finally started feeling confident, happy, free in a way that they never had before, and this was kind of a blossoming of their personality. So, isn't experiences like this, and then again this kind of big pushback on the binary, and again people finding the comfort in these in gender identities and in sex identities, sexual identities, right? Doesn't that, just challenge kind of the old church's paradigm of sex as binary?
Well, the problem is that comfort is often ephemeral. It's not uncommon that when someone embraces a different gender identity, one that's different than their sex, and again, this is setting aside the intersex condition, which Megan, I think, has stated very beautifully how complicated that can be. But for someone who embraces that, there is a short-term comfort. They're immediately embraced by new friends, by social media groups, sometimes even going through the cross-sex hormones and the surgery can cause short-term ameliorative effects on mental health. But if you look over the long haul, that's not the case. And the United States is way behind the rest of the world in this. If you look at countries like the UK, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, these were all the world pioneers in so-called gender-affirming care, encouraging the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries for individuals who identified as transgender. And every single one of those countries has shut down their gender clinics. They consider gender care now to only be experimental at best, and that's because the data that they got back was so bad. And you might ask yourself, well, how come they've got better data than we do? Well, for one, they've been doing it a lot longer, and they also do it without as many societal issues, reprobation and things like that, as you might have in the United States. They're more affirming cultures for trans identities. But in addition, they've got national healthcare systems, and so you can follow patients from the time that they get a treatment until the end of their life. Whereas in the United States, if someone goes to the University of Michigan Gender Clinic and they have cross-sex hormones, and then the university comes to find them 5 years later, they may only be able to find 1/3 of the participants and ask them how they're doing today. And that's not a scientific result at all. So what these long-term studies say is that, by and large, these interventions have not been helpful. For an average person who has gender dysphoria, now this is a very specific mental health diagnosis where they actually have mental health issues as a result of the discomfort between their gender identity and their sexed body. They've got a suicide rate that's about 12 times the rest of the population. But in the long-term studies from Sweden, those adults who had gone through and done the whole thing, done the surgery, they had suicide rates that were 19 times the rate of the general population, with higher incidence of mental health issues as well and other comorbidities. People who use puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and the surgeries suffer from all kinds of different things. I mean, the obvious loss of fertility and sexual function, but also loss in bone density and heart problems and emotional and other physical developmental problems. And so the science just doesn't show that these types of interventions over the long haul are helpful. And what's particularly concerning, and why Megan and I share the concern about children, is that the studies show that 80 to 95% of kids who experience gender dysphoria will naturally align their mind with their body if they're just left to their own devices and they're not affirmed with transsexual pronouns or clothing or sports teams or or puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. In contrast, if you affirm the gender ideology, 98% of those kids are likely to continue persisting in their gender dysphoria and going down the road of these medical treatments that the best studies that we have show aren't really helping anybody. So I think the medical science on this is more well developed than we recognize in the United States. But if you look at the long-term studies, they're pretty conclusive that this isn't helping. Now, where Megan and I think, completely agree, again, is that for some individuals, physically, if they're in the intersex condition, they need to be accompanied. They need our love, and they need our support. And there isn't one size fits all answers for them. But even if you would take the statistics that would suggest the largest percentage of intersex people, 1.7%, would that be about the highest?
That's the highest
Yeah,
that you'll
the high end of
hear
your range.
among experts, yeah.
You know, we've got states now where 10% of the kids are identifying as transgender. So that means many, many, many multiples of kids beyond the ones who are experiencing the physical issues that we both can agree on are pursuing a route that ultimately is going to lead to long-term physical and mental health harm for them. And that's something as Christians that we should all be concerned about if we value their welfare and their long-term flourishing.
Megan, did you want to respond to anything there?
Sure. I just wanted to clarify that the clinics that they're shutting down are the clinics for children, and that the rates for those who are getting sex reassignment, gender affirming surgeries as adults, they actually have a high rate of satisfaction and lower suicidality. So we just need to be clear about which clinics that we're talking about.
Well, the Swedish study is just adult transitions. That doesn't have anything to do with the kids.
The Dutch studies and some of the others are focused on children, and the CAS report was talking about.
The CAS report absolutely was about kids.
That's the one that's come out most
Yes.
recently in the UK. Those are the clinics, and really they're not saying we should shut it down. The report actually says we need better mental health and social support. We need all of these other things to help these kids to find out which ones are these, 80 to 95% who are going to desist, and which ones do need these kinds of medical transitions. So we need more medical and psychological and social help for kids who have questions about gender identity, not less. So they're really saying, let's not rush to surgery. Our system doesn't have the capacity to support kids with gender dysphoria the way that they need to be supported. And questions about suicidality, these can also be related to social rejection, family rejection, the inability to get a job. I talked to you about my friend who was a theologian, his ability to get a job. It's been 10 years, more than 10 years. And the transphobia in our world, people, you don't get hired. There's so many other factors that can contribute to mental health decline, related or unrelated to medical interventions. So that's what those are the things I wanted to clarify.
Megan, maybe I could follow up with you on the transgender question. And so there's many people, and you can tell us where you stand on this, but there's many people who believe that we have complete authority over our gender identity. Right. So if I identify as a woman, I am in fact a woman. But and then we need other people to recognize these claims, right? So, but doesn't this kind of thinking about sex and gender lead to a situation where anyone can identify as whatever they want, and then other people are compelled to acknowledge maybe things that they believe are false?
This is a challenge, and this is why we need to be careful with our language. And there are a lot of people on both sides who use biological sex and conflate it with gender identity. And I think they shouldn't be conflated. When you go to the doctor, they need to know about your body. They need to know what sex traits you have and if you've altered any of them, so that they can treat your body. They need to know how you identify to speak to you as a person, right? So you may identify as a woman, but have a male body, that means you're a trans woman. So the doctor needs to know, not that you're a woman, but that you're a trans woman, because they're treating your body. And you give some examples of this, of a trans woman going in for medical treatment, and they didn't have her records, or a trans man going in for treatment, and they didn't have in her records that she had a female body, and she was actually pregnant and giving birth, and the baby died because they didn't think that that was a possibility, because her medical record said she was a man. So this is where we need to know about biological sex, we need to know about gender identity, and this is where the conversations around sports and all of those other things matter, because they're not the same thing. They matter, and some of the time, like I was saying with intersex folks, we don't let the doctors choose. With some of these kids whose bodies are in between, we let them come to understand how they understand themselves, and that's what we follow. So there is something about understanding oneself that's important, and recognizing. So the people who want to just say, okay, when you're a trans woman, you're a woman, and that's the end of the story. We need more. We need to be more nuanced, not to be critical. The problem is it's just not safe in our society. So if you say the truth, I'm a trans woman or a trans man, you're not safe. So it's easier to just say, I'm a man, I'm a woman, and go stealth and just try to hide and fit in with everybody else, because our rigid binary is harassing and hurting so many people. Intersex, endosex, trans, it doesn't matter. I have female friends who are tall and have big shoulders and a square jaw, and they go into the female restroom and people are looking at them funny, as if they shouldn't be there. This is not okay. Yes, we need to be concerned about children. Yes, we need to be more careful in these conversations, but we also need to start treating each other with dignity. I mean, you talk, and the bishop's talking about, we have to go by people's chromosomes, like that's where we know what their sex is, but we don't get to see what people's chromosomes are. We don't know what they are. And so one of the things that I want to bring into this conversation is humility. You don't know what's going on in somebody's body. You don't know their story. And so making assumptions about them and treating them based on your assumptions is not a charitable Christian way to be.
John, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, well, I agree with a great deal of that. I think we need more compassion and more love in our world. We don't live in a very Christian world. We don't live in a very Christian country. And everybody is, as a child of God, entitled to dignity and worth. And, if we could all recognize that, a lot of these problems would become solvable because we could discuss them. At the same time, in culture right now, if 10% of the kids are identifying as trans, then this is going far beyond an intersex problem. If you accept, my number about the number of transsex individuals in society, this again is based on the gametes versus other things. It's basically the same likelihood as flipping a quarter and having it land on the edge and just stay there and not be heads or tails. Now, is that possible? Yes, it is, but it's also extremely rare. It doesn't change the fact that we're going to use the quarter in everyday life to determine what heads or tails is. It doesn't mean that the quarter is a tertiary rather than a binary instrument. And where I get concerned is where Megan starts to talk about compassion for intersex conditions, which is totally appropriate, and then allows that to all of a sudden bleed into maybe 10% of the population, which is denying the reality of their human body. And to go back to the Cass report and some of these their foreign reports, the Cass report does not say we're going to keep giving kids puberty blockers, but make sure they get more mental health too. They're saying no more puberty blockers for kids because it's not showing that it's working. If anything, it's increasing the incidence of mental health problems with these kids. And so in loving others, which I think both of us desperately want, we need to be careful that we follow the science where the science is important, and that we follow the truth when someone is going past the science into something that is just not acknowledging the reality that they live in. Because mean, Pope John Paul II talks about this too, that there is no love without truth. That if we act charitably towards someone, we give them what they want, but we don't do it in a way that's what's best for them because we know the truth and they don't, then that can actually be cruel. And so acting in love and truth simultaneously is what's so important. And as long as we're on JP2, one other thing I wanted to push back on, I don't think he would say that the marital relationship is the only icon of God. I mean, he talked all the time about the marriage between Christ and his church and about the community. And one of the reasons that Catholics hold up our priests and our sisters, our nuns, who take vows of celibacy is not because that denigrates marriage, but because it celebrates it. That marriage is so wonderful that their sacrifice, willing to give that up, is itself an icon of Christ, who gave up his body for the church as they give up their bodies for the church. So I don't think it's the exclusive icon of the Trinity, but I do think it's an important way to understand Genesis, especially when you look at the eunuch passage in Matthew 19, and what Jesus was talking about there was the importance of marriage. He wasn't talking about the importance of a third sex.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I didn't mean to, if I misspoke, I didn't mean to say it was the only icon, but he does hold it up as if it's the most important of the icons. That was my as I was reading, those many, many, many pages, that was the impression that I got there. I think there are a couple more things. I am concerned about how many kids it's called rapid onset, in these tween years are going here. Adolescence is a very difficult time. When you live in a good family with parents who love you, it's really hard. When you live in a toxic world with dysfunctional, adolescence is hard. It's not just the hormones, the brain is pruning itself. There's so much happening over that course that we need caution. But there are also factors, I know some biologists who think, well, we've got a lot of plastics in our system. Plastics are endocrine disruptors. Is some of the increase coming from what's happening in our environment? We are also learning a lot more about neurodiversity. Autistic people have a 10% rate of identifying with a gender that does not match their assigned sex at birth. That tells me there's something biological going on that we need to be careful about and pay attention to. And the rise in girls being identifying as trans, we're only now kind of catching up to girls being diagnosed with autism and some other neurodiversities. So I think I'm worried about how fast it's going, and I do think we need a lot of caution, but there are also other factors too that again, we need humility, we need to be careful, we need to go slowly, we need to love our kids well, we need to educate our children, because they can learn a lot. If we can educate them and love them about the process, they can learn how to make good decisions. But what I don't like about some of this conversation is we treat all trans people as if they're children, as if they can't make responsible decisions weighing the risks. Because there are risks with these surgeries, but they have to weigh the risk of this physical challenge versus this mental health challenge. And they're adults who should have the freedom to make those choices for themselves.
This is a good transition into student questions.
Yay.
But some of these are just to one or the other of you, but I think the other one can feel free to jump in afterwards. So the first one is from a student for Dr. DeFranza. What is the Christian response to transgender identifying people who are not intersex? Right, so you earlier, I think, connected gender and rooted it in sex, and then this is cases that are maybe not that case. Is this a rejection of God's design for their life?
Well, this is where I think, do you know that they're not intersex? Do they know that they're not intersex? Have they had all of their cells tested? My friend Leanne has an X and an XX in some of her cells. She has a Y in some of her other cells. These are complicated. And so having some humility to say there may be something biologically going on here that I don't know about. So not being so quick to judge, to say, are you rejecting God's design? Maybe, but maybe your experience is difficult for some other reasons that I don't understand. But I'm not in a position, God can judge, but I can't judge. I don't know that information. And so I think we just need a lot more humility, and we need to be slower to judge people by what we see on the outside, and make room for the fact that things could be more complex in this case than we know. Does that answer?
Thank you. Good answers. Did you want to jump in or go to the next question?
I mean, I think caution is always advisable, and certainly being compassionate and caring. We've talked about that repeatedly. I think that's the theme that should really come out of this for all of us. There's caution the other way too. If you're talking about a 1 in 10,000 circumstance, and this person is pretty sure that they're male and they want to identify as female, it would be doing them a disservice not to talk to them about the scientific studies that show the results of some of these transitions. It would be a disservice not to talk to them about what it means to be authentically yourself. It would be a disservice not to talk to them about the experience of detransitioners who went to gender clinics, and rather than getting the very kind of careful diagnosis that Megan is talking about, were just quickly labeled as having gender dysphoria, handed puberty blockers, and then cross-sex hormones, and then given a mastectomy at age 16. What you'll hear from the detransitioners is that the medical community is not treating this cautiously, that it's a one-size-fits-all, everybody rush in. As soon as you express a different gender identity, then you're on this one-way path, and it's got terrible consequences. And the one thing that would haunt me as a Christian would be to have a friend who went through all that and then realized that they made a mistake because they did reject God's plan for their body, and then couldn't get everything back together again. A woman who could never nurse a baby as a result of her surgery, coming back to me and saying, well, you knew about all this, why didn't you say something? So I think speaking truth in love is important, proceeding cautiously is important, and every one of us needs to figure out what that looks like in the context of the relationships that we have with family and friends.
Please speak about the influence of social media and unfettered smart devices on mental health. Please.
We could be here a long time. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. I'm not new to these conversations. None of us should be getting medical advice from social media unless you are following a physician or a medical expert, right? We have to teach our kids media literacy about everything, and including what's going on around questions of gender. Because as much as I have trans friends whom I love and I respect, and they're wonderful people, they're wonderful Christians, there are some trans folk who deny that some people regret transitioning. They don't want those voices to be heard. You give examples of the media suppressing these voices. Their voices are just as important. Their experience is just as important, and they need our love, and they're getting criticized from both sides, which is not how things should be. So gosh, we could go on so long. Anxiety's up, depression is up, questioning one's sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these things are up, and attention spans are down. So actually having nuanced conversations is just harder and harder and harder. It's a nightmare. You want to jump in on this one?
100% agreement here. You may have seen in the Atlantic recently that some of the Ivy League schools are struggling because their incoming freshmen can't read a complete book cover to cover. That is a direct result of cell phones and social media. Pull the plug. Don't allow your kids to have it. It causes all the things that Megan's talking about.
So there's another question that connects, wondering if this is connected with the rise in transgenderism, especially amongst teenage girls who are generally more susceptible to social media fads, and also the idea of our having virtual identities that we deeply invest in, and that makes it easier to imagine an identity that's not connected to our bodies.
Is there a question in there?
That was the question. It said, "Talk to it."
Talk about this?
I only have one hand, but is there? I mean, so you both properly lamented the social media and technology, but is it related to this phenomena, this rise in transgenderism?
Well, the social contagion that Megan was talking about, I think, can be tied to that. Abigail Schreier wrote a really good book on this called Irreversible Damage, and it's about this trend where all of a sudden a whole group of girls will come out as transgender at the same time. This is the exact opposite of the kinds of struggles that Megan is talking about with individuals who have the intersex condition. They do it for social reasons, and maybe we don't know, but one of the reasons why the rates of trans identification among autistic kids is so high is because of the difficulty that they have sometimes establishing deep and fulfilling relationships with others. Some people say that 60% of trans-identifying kids today are on the autism spectrum, which would be consistent with your number that 10% of them identify as trans. And so social media is certainly feeding into all that, whether it's giving them ideas that they otherwise wouldn't have had, whether it's indoctrinating them or inculcating them in social media groups that support only one path and not the type of discernment that we've been talking about. Those could all be contributors.
I think we have to be honest too. There's good stuff on the internet. There's good stuff in social media. My daughters follow body positivity people on social media now, and they benefit from that, from hearing about celebrating diversity. So it's not all bad. And particularly the internet, when we finally had that in the 90s, I remember before the internet, I'm that old.
Preach it, sister.
Yeah, like intersex people, trans people, gay people sometimes knew no one. And the internet made it possible for them to find someone with their experience who could say, "You're not crazy," or "If you are, I am too." But people would be told, "You are never going to meet anybody like you," which leads to feelings of depression, isolation, "I'm a freak." All of a sudden, the internet is connecting you with people around the globe who have your rare experience, but you're not alone in your humanity. So we do have to, there are positive things out there, but our job is to keep our kids close and to talk with them and be in their lives. I mean, so much of the breakdown of the family in our society, we live in a toxic culture. We just do. It's very difficult. We don't have the village. We don't have the extended family to help raise children. 2-parent homes, is that enough to raise kids? No, there's so much in our society that makes parenting children and raising them well very difficult in this. And social media is a piece of that, but it's bigger.
John, why have you settled on gamete production as the marker for sex and intersex?
I think just scientifically, it's the cleanest. I don't think that you can necessarily pick one and say that's the right one. Scientists will disagree about that. But for me, that's the easiest. That doesn't mean that there aren't multi-chromosomal syndromes. There aren't syndromes where someone's receptors are blocked. I mean, Megan talked about all those. I even learned about some reviewing her book before this. But that's just a clear line of demarcation that is easy to follow.
Is it also because it kind of fits with kind of Catholic value of procreation, that's one that seems like the one we should go with? Because it used to be gonads. That's where we went.
Yeah, I don't think it's related to Catholic procreation at all, although the Catholic Church does put a high value on procreation because of the Great Commission to be fruitful and multiply, that we view kids as a gift. And I hope all Christian denominations feel that way about kids.
Can you discuss the concerns of sexual assault for allowing trans in male-female locker rooms and bathrooms?
A lot of the questions around assault are people posing as trans people in order to assault other. I live in Massachusetts. We've had trans protections for longer than most states. When we told people they could use whatever bathrooms they identified with, we did not have a jump in sexual assault. People are afraid of predators, but identifying trans people as predators is a huge problem. Most of our predators are cis-het men. Do we want to just put all of them somewhere away? Or do we want to say they're all predators? No. We just need to be really careful. And yes, we need to protect people. And I think having kids change in front of each other in general, nobody wants to do that. I didn't want to do that back in the day. We need kids to have more privacy. We need, bathroom stalls. I go into some in universities where they go all the way from the floor to the ceiling. Where we're protecting everybody, but we're not assuming that a certain kind of person is a predator.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think the problem comes when government officials too quickly rush to do something that they think is compassionate without thinking about the predators. So, for example, in California, they opened up the female prisons to men who identified as women. And I can't imagine how that would go wrong. The number of births in the women prisons went from 0 to skyrocketing, and now there's a class action lawsuit by female prisoners in California for all the assaults that they've suffered at the hands of cis heterosexual men who identified as women and were only too quickly accommodated and put in a situation where they could harm and abuse other people. So I think we just need to be really careful when we think about those policies that we're protecting women too.
And that we're protecting trans people who are also very vulnerable to assault.
Where would you draw the line with men and women's sports?
That's a tough one, I'll be honest. And this is where, I can get in trouble like lots of other people. When a male body goes through puberty, even if you block those hormones afterward, there are changes in the body, in the oxygenation, in the muscles that you can't reverse. So there are advantages that are conferred to those going through puberty. Caitlyn Jenner, big trans icon, was an Olympian when they were named Bruce, and she has said, I would never compete against a woman. It wouldn't be fair. So it's tough. We have to be really careful about fairness here, and it's really complicated because then, do the trans and intersex people, do they have their own league? There's not an easy answer, but we do need to be, this is again where we need to be clear that biological sex is not the same as gender identity, and we can change certain sex traits, but there are some we can't change, and going all the way through puberty, going all the way through a male puberty is going to confer certain physical advantages on that individual. So I'll get hate mail for that.
I agree with that, and I do get hate mail for that. But the science is really irrefutable on that a male who has gone through puberty will always, on average, have advantages over female competitors. And that's why you'll see a teenage boy who was 440th in the state in track or in swimming all of a sudden winning first place when they switched to the girls' divisions. And there's something that's not right about that. The reason that we enacted Title IX was to give women their own space where they could compete and not only have an opportunity to be in the race, but have an opportunity to win. And when you have the situation like in Connecticut where the two boys identified as girls and took 15 state track and field championships, that's really denying the whole point of having a women's division. So we need, again, to protect women.
This is another one probably toward Megan. John brought this up before, and we passed over it, but how do we explain other word used here is how do we explain other deformities in the human body, and how do these differ from how we see intersex differences?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think what we're learning now is to actually talk to the people for whom this is their bodily experience. So we have intersex people who will speak theologically and ethically about their experience. Some intersex people say, I really feel like I have a medical condition. Others say, my body is fine. It's just that my personhood, my gender identity doesn't fit into the world that we have it. So they're different experiences. We have people in the deaf community. There's capital D deaf, where they don't want cochlear implants. They want their culture. And some deaf folks have written theological treatises saying, I'm not going to be a hearing person in heaven. Sign is going to be one of the languages by which we worship. And so having them be part of the conversation, some deaf people are wanting cochlear implants. So having them be a part of the conversation is really, really important. Not to make so that ableist assumptions, so that I'm as an ableist person or someone without I have some disabilities that you can't see, that I'm not making choices for someone else's experience. I probably don't need to keep going on about that.
Yeah,
If you want.
My daughter works with deaf population in some instances, and has run across that debate about whether you give the implants to the kids so that they can hear or not. Is that changing who God created them to be? I think we can have reasonable debates about that. My point was simply that when you have a body that develops in a way that's different than the norm, that doesn't mean that it's another kind of body, in the same way that the child who's got the congenital defect of their hand doesn't have a different kind of hand. It's just a hand that didn't develop the way that it was supposed to, and that we don't rewrite the rules of hands to accommodate the difference. We acknowledge the difference, treat that person with compassion, recognize that they have a place in the kingdom, and then work through what that means for them.
I think one of the differences, though, with intersex people is so people will bring up cleft palate and other stuff like that, and you don't see a lot of folks who had cleft palate surgeries as infants fighting with the doctors and saying, why did you do that to me? The intersex community has been active for decades, telling doctors, please don't try to fix children by doing plastic surgeries to make their genitals appear more masculine or more feminine. Like, you're not helping us. So again, listening to what are they saying? Like, many of them are saying, I do identify as intersex. That's who I am. I believe that when I'm resurrected in heaven, that if I'm not resurrected as an intersex person, I won't be me. So having those conversations with them is nuanced, and what we are hearing from intersex folks is that they don't want these corrective surgeries. They want their body, they want to have choice when they're old enough to have choice, to be able to make decisions about whether or not they want to alter their sex traits.
Yeah, and we have no disagreement on that.
Is the soul sexed? Theologian? He's just a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer.
Yeah. Oh gosh. When we talk about soul and body as if they are separate, we are going back to a Greek Gnostic way of talking about humanity. The Hebrew understanding of soul is a life, that God breathed life. We are a living soul, we're a living being. So I don't believe there is a soul that's separate from the body, but I don't, the whole, are we sexed, we can get into a lot here, but we are a unit. We are a unit. And for some people, for most people, that's clearly male, clearly female, and our bodies shape how we experience the world. Our brain is a part of our body, right? We forget that. We sometimes separate the mind from the body. It's not. It is so impacted It is a part of our body. So I am more with the Jewish scholars around how I understand soul than with the Greek tradition, which actually dominated most of Christian theology for a really long time.
Yeah, I fully agree. Reject the Gnostic notion that we're just minds trapped in a body. And as far as the brain is concerned, it's actually the most sexed organ in the body. We forget that in our modern culture sometimes. But men and women are different. I think we all know that intuitively. And a lot of that is because of the male and female brains that we have. And that's not something that's sexist or should cause differences. It's the kind of diversity that we should embrace in one another.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it was something I wanted to talk about too. Sex traits exist at so many levels. They exist at the chromosome type, they exist at the genetic level on those chromosomes, they exist at hormone ranges. How much do you have circulating? And what about those receptors? Can they process the hormones or not? You have gonads that can be testes or ovaries. Some have testicular tissue and ovarian tissue in the same gonad. You can have an ovum and a testis. So it can happen at that level. It can happen at the level of genitals. Like you either have a clitoris or you have a penis. It's the same thing. It's just testosterone is going to make one grow more outside of the body rather than inside of the body. So it can occur at the genital level. It can occur with secondary sex traits. And if we can have bodies that have variations at all those other levels, mixed sex traits, is it not conceivable that at the level of brains, since we have lots of hormone receptors in the brain, that we can have intersex brains as well? And this is where the neuroscience, we're not there yet. We don't know. But the science we have, in my opinion, I think points in that direction. Since we can see sex variations at all of these other levels and the brain is sexed, typical endosex males have more testosterone receptors in the brain than females. It's so fascinating.
My wife can multitask, I can't.
I have two more questions here, and then we should land the plane, but then we can, of course, come and talk to our speakers some more. But two hard questions. The Catholic Church and other denominations, it says, have church teachings that don't necessarily incite people to harm non-cisgendered people, but it is still the case that religious and conservative atmospheres are where harm does come to them. Why doesn't the church have as strong a condemnation for this violence as it so strongly condemns, say, homosexual lifestyles?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think part of this is just a misperception about the church. And I'll start with an example that was at the very beginning of my book. Back a few years, a department at the Vatican issued a long document explaining the church's view on human sexuality for Catholic schools. And it was very clear that schools were supposed to affirm kids in their maleness and their femaleness. And again, this is leaving aside the intersex. But for the kids who were identifying as a different sex or one of the many other trans identities, that was not something to be encouraged because that wasn't good for human flourishing. But the whole statement started by saying that every individual, no matter who they are, no matter how they identified, is entitled to love and respect and shouldn't be bullied. Like that was the baseline. And then the teaching started after that. And the New York Times responded to that by talking about how hateful and bigoted the Catholic Church was. So that the media took the "we need to love and care for everybody" message completely out of the document and just focused on its political disagreement with the church's understanding of human sexuality, which is based not only in Genesis and the rest of the Bible, but in science too. And so, yes, there is all kinds of harm happening to all kinds of people of all kinds of identities by religious and non-religious people alike. But I think if the Christian churches' teachings are fairly presented, we are called to love. That's exactly Megan's point. She talks in her book about Galatians. When Paul says, there'll be neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, neither woman nor man. That's how we're supposed to be thinking about each other. That we're all God's children, and we should all be treated with dignity and respect. The New York Times doesn't get that about the church, or if it does, it doesn't want people to know that. But it's important that as Christians, we let people know that the church is all about love. That's what Jesus was here to do. And then we can't let those kinds of media narratives that somehow the church is either explicitly or even implicitly allowing harm and bullying to happen to people is true, because it's not.
Two things I want to say to that. The document that you reference is problematic in a lot of ways in that it conflates transgender and intersex people, and when it doesn't, it recommends early surgeries to correct intersex kids.
I don't think we're talking about the same document.
The male and female God created them, 2019.
On education? Mm-hmm. That's not talking about surgery.
There are, in that way, it was 2019?
It was for schools, not for doctors or...
No, this was talking about when people are ambiguously sexed, don't worry, the doctors can figure that out. So it's not even letting individuals or their parents decide. It's recommending that doctors will know what the sex of this child really is. So there's some problems in what is coming down from the Vatican about trans and intersex, and there's a lot of problems with our laws too. Almost all, if not all, of the anti-trans bills that are being put out carve out exceptions for intersex kids. They say, don't mess with the way God created people's bodies. Unless they're intersex, then it's okay to go in and fix what God did wrong. This is a big problem. Okay, I don't know how much time we have. I have one other thing I wanted to say, is that the Catholic Church for a very long time, and I went to a Catholic, so I have great respect for the good things in the Catholic Church. I am a white evangelical. I have respect for the good things and a lot of dissatisfaction with a lot of the bad things. I'm just saying, there's good in our traditions and there's bad in our traditions. But the Catholic Church is saying right now, never alter the sex traits of an individual. But for centuries, they altered the sex traits of boys, castrating them, so that they could have sopranos in the choir, because it was a sin for women to speak or sing in church. The last castrato singer who sang in the Sistine Chapel, you can go on YouTube and find a recording of his voice. He's called the Last Angel of Rome. His name was Alessandro Maurici, and this was a tradition that went year after year after year. I have a whole 50-page chapter on eunuchs in my book, if you want to. There were times in the early Christian Roman side and in the Eastern Orthodox side where eunuchs, castrated or naturally born, had a place in the church. It was not considered a mortal sin to castrate a boy, to give him a job as a eunuch. So there's a long history here where the Catholic Church has approved of the changing of sex traits for certain purposes, to keep women quiet in church but still have sopranos. So anyway, it's complicated. It's kind of a low blow. It's a dig. But I just feel for consistency, let's be honest.
Grossly exaggerated in many respects and no longer true anywhere in the world.
But he died about 100 years ago. It's not that long ago. This is what I'm saying, is this tradition lasted, a very long time until recently. And now, never touch it. Which I'm glad that we're not castrating boys against their will to make them sopranos. I wouldn't support that. I'm just saying the church has changed its tune on how important sexed bodies are over the course of its history. I have another 50 pages on a different chapter on kind of Christian teachings on sex and gender kind of through the ages. That's all in the big book that we don't have for sale in the back.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That actually leads to my last question, and this is my question. Sorry, students. If your questions didn't get asked, come talk to our speakers after the event. But you actually bring us to an important one. So, throughout history, there have been questions that have been so important that the church has had to come down on one side, and others have left or been excommunicated or formed their own churches. Is Jesus truly God? Yes or no? Is Jesus truly man? Yes or no? Right? These are church dividing questions, And many of us look back on those ones and say, yeah, well, the church did the right thing. Jesus is true God, true man. I'm glad we got that one. Is sex and gender one of those questions that can or should divide the church?
I think it is. I don't know if it's can or should, but I think it already is. I mean, the church has been hemorrhaging God's children for decades, if not centuries, for folks who don't fit what we think they should be or look like or who they should love. Like, they are leaving. Some of them are joining other churches, some are not. So I think it is already happening. It's already divided the church. And I don't think it's going to be something where we're going to be able to find middle ground. I won't go to churches where women can't be pastors or preachers. That's a conviction I have. I can respect other Christians who have that. I don't like it. But there are some things that we're going to separate over. And I think this is one we already have, and I think we're going to continue for better and for worse.
Well, I don't think we should ever allow numbers of people in the pew to define what the church should hold on to and what it should let go. Pope Francis, in talking about gender ideology in the past year, talked about the importance of recognizing our sexed body and soul. And he said that when we reject that, again, this is not the intersex condition, but for someone who expresses a gender that's different than their sex, not for medical reasons, but for other reasons, that it makes it difficult to satisfy the two great commandments, love of God and love of neighbor. Well, why is that? Because our body is a gift, however it's been created. And when we reject what God gave us in our body, we're rejecting that gift, and so we're breaching that relationship with God. At the same time, if we can't live out who we are authentically with other people, if we have to live as something that we're not, and Megan says, and I agree with this, that we are embodied souls, then it makes it impossible to love neighbor the way that we're called to. And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that the question is an awfully important one because it goes to the core of what it means to be a Christian. I think the takeaway from all of this, and there's lots to agree on, is that all of us are on a journey, that we all see the importance of looking to the Bible to guide us on that journey, and that we see Jesus Christ as the pinnacle of our existence. It's who we model ourselves after, who we want to be, and who we want to spend eternity with. And I think if we can focus on those, talk a lot more, and do it in a civil way like we have tonight, that we can make a lot more progress than through all the electioneering and campaigning that you see on social media and the newspapers and other places. And so I'm just so grateful to every one of you for being part of our conversation tonight, and I hope that this won't be the end of your conversation.
Amen.
I do. Well, just